This is Power 98.7. And now you're listening to Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday, taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
Welcome back, Bandana Benkosi. We're going to be talking to the question of debt this morning. The Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which is an academy of the Catholic Church, released the report, the Jubilee Report, titled The Blueprint for Tackling the Debt and Development Crisis and Creating the Financial Foundations for a sustainable, people-centered global economy, commissioned by Pope Francis. This is an interesting report, very important intervention to the problems faced, especially by developing countries with regards to being trapped in debt. The report is, as it were, commissioned by Pope Francis, and there's a lot of commissioners chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who is a professor at Columbia University and also a founder and co-president of Initiative for Policy Dialogue. I'm joined by one of the commissioners, Charles Abugre. I hope I've pronounced the name properly. Welcome to Power Talk, and thanks very much for creating time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and you did pronounce my name correctly.
I'm lucky. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Charles. Is it fine if I say Charles?
Charles is excellent.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm also, Charles is from the International Development Economics Associate. He's a director of International Development Economics Associates and one of the commissioners. There's a whole lot of them here. I won't be able to go through their names in full. I'm also joined by G20 project lead at the Institute for Economic Justice, who is also with us here in studio, Kamal Ramburuth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndlozi.
Yes.
It's great to be on here.
Please help me. I don't want to butcher your name.
It's Ramburuth.
Ramburuth.
Yeah,
okay.
that's good.
Thanks, and welcome indeed to Power Talk.
Thank
Charles, let me start with you, just for the benefit of our listeners. The church, big step here by the church, and not always new, of course, in the history of the Catholic Church. It's always been at the center of trying to advocate for social justice. But the background to this specific report, just for the benefit of our listeners, how did it come about? How did it come to be commissioned? And how was it compiled?
The question is to me, right?
Yes, Charles.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Dr. Ngozi. This year is another Jubilee year. If you remember 25 years ago, which was the last Jubilee, it comes every 25 years, the world actually mobilized to radically address the debt crisis then facing many poor countries. So you might recall the Jubilee debt campaign. It involves not just the Catholic Church, but also many churches, many religious organizations, civil society broadly. And in 25 years ago, it has a massive support of governments, both from the North and the South. Jubilee year is a historical thing which has its foundations actually in Greece, whereby every 25 years, creditors wipe out the debts of their debtors. landowners who grab lands from landless peasants return those lands to the peasants. Those who held slaves freed those slaves. It is like resetting the society every 25 years. So this Jubilee year, before Pope Francis died, he put together a commission drawn from across the globe, as you said, chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz and assisted by Dr. Martín Guzmán. Martín Guzmán was the finance minister for Argentina and is credited for having had the most radical private sector debt restructuring ever in the world. He also is a member of the Institute for Policy Dialogue, working with Joseph Stiglitz. As I said, the commission is drawn from across the world, from a range of expertise, from economists to lawyers to social activists and people who work in the U.S. Treasury, in the banking sector, and civil society activists. This is the context in which the commission was put together, and it had really just about 4 months to do its work.
And as a point of departure, the report says about 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payment of debts than on health, and 2.1 billion live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on education. International payment on public debts, says the report, are therefore crowding out critical investments in health, education, infrastructure, and climate resilience. This is sort of the basis, as it were, to frame the crisis. Could you speak to us about precisely this question of the debt crisis? I mean, if you could unpack it for us, the current debt situation in developing countries.
This context is important because what is usually actually remembered as debt crisis, developing country debt crisis, was in the 1990s, which was associated with the bond crisis, mainly of large middle-income countries from Latin America. They held so much bond debt and were threatening default that the impact was likely to be very disruptive of the international financial system. As a result, the United States government took upon itself, to create mechanisms to reduce this risk of a systemic collapse of the international bond market in particular. This time, or even the last Jubilee, the United States did not take such leadership because it was considered that the current debt crisis, which is contained, as you say, seriously around 24 or 25 countries, but broadly impacting about 3 to 4 countries, faced no threat to the international financial system at all, because put all together, all of the African debt, including the South African ones, will be really broadly equivalent to the GDP of Germany. It's not a lot. It could be cancelled without any impact at all.
What is that in real terms, Professor?
In real terms, we are talking about less than $500 billion. Okay. And that's very small in the scheme of things. But the crisis is serious. If you go beyond these big numbers and the system itself, as you can see, the report is making the point that is really condemning billions of people to, to either a threat of not having access to education or healthcare, or even the inability to invest in capital formation, it calls, which is the infrastructure for social and economic development, including investment in machinery and technology that enables these countries to then break free from poverty and dependence. And so there is a development crisis facing a lot of these countries who have found themselves stuck with debts. And the worst manifestation of those, as you can see, are those who have defaulted, like Zambia, like my own country, Ghana, like Ethiopia, that was making a lot of progress, like Mali, and so on. And or those that are taking all, steps, very costly steps, to avoid a formal default, such as Kenya. As you can see, these very extreme measures that Kenya took in order to raise taxes, to prevent a debt crisis, to prevent a default, led to massive social upheaval, with Generation Z taking the streets, and hundreds of them were shot and killed, and many of them are still being abducted, being murdered in cold blood, and that is all in response. So the social impact of crisis, even if it is not affecting the system itself, can be devastating for developing countries. And this is the reason why the report is really making the appeal that, this we should not turn, and rich countries should not turn a blind eye to this crisis that is emerging. It is small in relation as a global system, therefore it can be addressed. The Jubilee year is the moment in which at least one major effort can be made again to address this crisis affecting developing countries. And it also makes the point that whilst there are short-term ways to address the crisis in the short term, it also lays out, strategies and proposals on how to ensure debt sustainability in the long run, but ensuring that economies grow and the climate threat can be managed.
Let me come to you. This framing, as it were, of the problem faced by developing countries in relation to debt. What's your reaction? Is this an adequate way of describing that it's because of indebtedness, debt service costs, that these countries are trapped and unable to address health, education, and in some instances, food insecurity problems?
Definitely. I think Charles framed it really well. Ultimately, what many countries on our continent are having to do is we're having to choose between servicing debt and developing. And this is an unfair position to be put in, especially in the context of global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals that the world had set for itself for 2030. Currently, 85% of those goals are off track. And this is within a context of a continent in which 751 million people in Africa are spending more on servicing debt than of course, developmental outcomes like health and education. And the impact of this is really human, right? When you spend less on hospitals, more people die, right? When you spend less on adequate housing and food, people die, right? So the impact of the debt crisis is infiltrating our societies through austerity measures that many countries are having to self-impose, and the consequences are really fatal. Just to give you some context on this, in Africa, right, despite a relatively low debt stock, right, the interest payments, the cost of borrowing in Africa is significantly higher. The most recent statistics from 2023 show that while debt servicing costs in Oceania and Asia are around 5.3%, in Latin America they're about 6.8%, in Africa they're around 9.8% on average.
Why is that?
There's a range of reasons for this. Right. One of the reasons is that there's been a shift away from traditional foreign borrowing from what's called your kind of OECD Western countries, who had historically lent most of the foreign borrowing to African countries. And there's been an increase in borrowing from private capital markets. Right. These private capital markets are generally make the assessment of how much the debt should cost based on the assessments made by credit rating agencies, which have been found continuously to have biased ratings and overestimate the cost of capital in many African countries. And I mean, there's a number of other reasons.
The risk.
Yes, of course. Risk is always embedded in the cost of capital. So this is one of the issues that we face around the high cost of capital. Another one of the issues that we face around the reason that the cost of capital is so high is because of this idea that African states or developing countries will default, right? The risk premium is the risk of default, right? Yes. And one of the real problems that we have in our current situation is that developing countries are too scared to default because the current system of default, which is called the G20 Common Framework, is completely inadequate. It's slow. It doesn't bring private creditors to the table. It doesn't allow for enough of a haircut or debt relief. And so countries are looking at the process of restructuring, and they're saying, well, if we look at Zambia, for example, it took Zambia 4 years to have a resolution to their default. I would rather not default, and I would rather swallow the bitter pill of a higher cost of capital than default, have 4 years of being locked out of capital markets, and not have access
which could
to
actually
that
result into serious social upheaval, protest, and all of that on the ground, or this death question that you're speaking about, healthcare, housing, and maybe not even being able to respond to natural disasters. Exactly,
and that's what we saw in Kenya, for example. William Ruto decided that instead of defaulting, instead of going to the common framework, the G20 common framework for restructuring, he decided that we would raise taxes and impose the pain on the population.
Charles, let me get back to you about the report has a section where it lays out, in fact, the question of the inadequacy of the current global finance framework for resolving over-indebtedness, as it were. Could you speak to us about that?
Okay, so this building on the previous, there is a systemic problem with the way the international system works. That systemic problem is that it is the benefits and risks shared between developing and developed countries is asymmetrical, meaning that it's unbalanced. You have a situation where when there is a downturn in the global economy, for example, and sometimes that downturn, most of it, is not necessarily caused by developing countries or debtor countries. It's global in the sense that you either have a pandemic or you have a financial crisis coming out of the US or things like that. There is always a flight of capital from developing countries to safer havens. This is basically in dollar-denominated havens and to some extent the euro. And this is when these countries actually need capital. It is also in these periods of crisis that the cost of capital is the highest. And so the countries that most need capital have to pay a high risk premium. Meanwhile, capital already existing in their economies fly out. So in periods of crisis, even when those crises is generated from developed countries, they benefit. This is the first one. The second one is systemic again for African and many small developing countries, is that they have inherited historical structural constraints which are stubborn, hard to break. And these historical constraints have to do with the way these economies have been entrenched in the global trading system as commodity producers. We talk beneficiation, but it's not so easy. Even when you beneficiate minerals, the backward and forward linkages effects are limited. And breaking out of that, commodity production imposed structure is slow and hard. Only a few countries have managed to do it. And so they are constantly having to deal with this problem. And then there's a third point, which is that the capital that is available in the private capital markets tend to be short-term. You borrow 3, 4, 5-year bonds and so on at exceedingly high interest rate, as has been explained, why the risk premium is so high that leads back to very high interest rates. And even when, so they borrow them for the short term, but their development needs require capital which is longer and patient. And because they need them for infrastructure, they need them for industry. Industry takes much longer than 3 to 4, 5 years to have a return. So you have a risk mismatch between the cost and expectations of capital and the period of returns. That already throws these countries straight into debt, which is the reason why they are constantly borrowing from the same capital market to recycle the debts that they now have. And this is the tragedy of the last decade or so since 2015, when many of these countries were actively encouraged by the IMF in particular, to move out of official sources of financing, which tend to be cheaper and longer term, into the private bond market at a time that the cost of capital was relatively low because of the crisis in the United States following the 2008 crisis and then the recession. The quantitative easing from the United States pumped a lot of dollars into the banking system and into the bond markets.
Okay.
And so they were, so this is the thing. So these systemic issues are explain why countries are finding it very difficult to get themselves out of debt.
Let me take the headlines and then we're going to continue right after that here on Power Talk. It's 10:30 and I'm going to take the headlines with Nyaka Lotte for. Please stay tuned.
Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, where your voice is heard and opinion matters.
Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. We continue with that conversation regarding the debt entrapment by or on developing countries, and I am online discussing the report released by the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences called the Jubilee Report, commissioned by the late Pope Francis. As I indicated, I'm joined by the executive director, who is actually one of the commissioners, Charles Abugre, the executive director of International Development Economics Associates, and Kamal Ramburuth of G20 project lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. Charles, you were concluding the status of the institutions, specifically private capital markets and the ways in which they actually exacerbated this debt situation. And I wanted to ask about another aspect which the report speaks to, the problem that it says is the proliferation of bilateral investment treaties that have subjected developing countries to a rising tide of costly legal claims, becoming another source of opaque contingent liabilities. And it gives the example of Philip Morris using Uruguay for its anti-smoking, suing Uruguay rather, for its anti-smoking legislation. And this being at the center of threatening the economic sovereignty of countries. Charles?
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah.
I'm muted. Thanks for getting back to me on this. Yes, this is an important point. You will find that in addition to the constraints imposed, by membership of the World Trade Organization, many of the developing countries also have these multiple bilateral agreements. These bilateral investment agreements really they affect everything from the more obvious issue which we dealt with, which is that it leads to all sorts of ridiculous claims. The Ghanaians call it judgment debt. So countries get dragged into court for not delivering one agreement or the other, which they then use the bilateral investment agreement as a backing point and then make many claims. Those claims are, first, the nominal values of the claim that they are making. And second, there is another claim, which is the so-called prejudgment debt claim. And there is a standard amount charge. Once a company takes you or a creditor takes a country to court, there is already a 9% of the claim charged as cost, and it is upfront in case in case the claim takes a long time to resolve. So this creates a perverse incentive, which means that the lawyers of the creditors will deliberately delay the process beyond a certain time in order to make this upfront 9% claim. Okay, so these judgment debts. There's a second problem associated with this bilateral investment agreement. They prevent countries from taking preventive measures against capital outflows during periods of crisis by putting in place capital account regulatory regimes. They force capital account liberalization. So we have these multiple bilateral agreements that policymakers and academics are not paying a lot of attention to, but it's helping to exacerbate the debt problem, but also to tie the hands of governments in terms of how they address periods of crisis.
Just before I go to how the report proposes all of these problems to be resolved, I thought, Kamal, you could speak to us about South Africa's own exposure to debt and specifically our debt service costs and the loans of IMF and the World Bank.
Sure, thanks so much, Mbuyiseni. Currently, South Africa's debt to GDP ratio is 76%, and the amount that we spend every year on servicing debt is around 390 billion rand in interest payments, which is about 22 cents to every rand. But I think what's important in understanding these numbers is really to understand that debt is neither something that is good nor bad. It is something that can be both. And the way that it translates into being something that is bad or burdensome is if the debt that you take in conversation with the future, because that's what debt is, right? It's a conversation with the future. How can I use resources now to create value in the future? It's problematic if we aren't able to host that conversation in a way that allows the development of the productive sectors of our economy, that doesn't allow our economy to grow. I mean, in South Africa, we don't necessarily have an extremely high debt to GDP ratio compared to other countries similar to ours. But we do have a big problem with our debt in the fact that we don't have a coherent and consistent plan for growth and development. And so any debt that we take that isn't spurring on the expansion of the productive sectors of our economy and isn't developing our economy and our society will be problematic, right?
And Charles is right. I mean, this is a sort of a point of departure for how the report proposes a way forward, that part of what should happen is borrowing should be specifically to, for instance, education needs, health needs, and in the case, for instance, of what Kamal is saying, specifically to infrastructure development and something that has a actual growth potential. But if you could, use that to speak to us about what the report proposes as a solution to the indebtedness or over-indebtedness or debt entrampment of developing countries.
Yeah, thanks. So let me just build on Kamal's point. So one of the key points made in the report is that debt, there's a dual responsibility. It's a shared responsibility between creditors and debtors. And the point is very important. On the debtor side, that debtors have an obligation to contract good debt wherever it is possible and to use that debt properly. This is Kamal's point about conversations about the future. Debtors must take the steps to reduce the dependence on foreign exchange related borrowing. So borrow appropriate currency for the appropriate expenses. You do not need to borrow in dollars to build a school, which is predominantly not requiring a major import because the roofing sheets are produced there, the blocks are there. You need local currency. And because foreign exchange debt has three problems. Problem number one is that interest rate and questions we've been talking and the mismatch. Problem number two is an exchange rate cost. Problem number three is a political cost of dependency and influence. If you can avoid it, do so. So, first major recommendation on the basis of shared responsibility is that developing countries must first should develop their capital market. But the capital market development must grow from a certain sequencing. One, make sure that you radically reform your state-owned enterprises sector so that it's competitive. Cut the waste. Second, make sure that you are developing development banks in your region or your country. And three, on the basis of those two, you are now able to develop the capital market. This is the bond market and the stock exchange, without which they are just speculative instruments that people make money without the money actually being going into productive investment. It's a very important point. The second related point, of course, is the corruption. So as we have seen from Ghana or Senegal or Zambia, there is so much irresponsible behavior of states. That is a responsibility we cannot run away from. Now, having said so, the other responsibility of the creditor, which they have been running away from, is that, as Kamal said, the interest rate, the yield, the language used for bonds, already incorporates the risks The bondholders already make their money when governments are paying. When governments are not paying, you take the haircut. Just like governments take the risk and their haircut from the risk that has come out of that relationship. The first one. The second principle is that there should not be a debt restructuring arrangement that leads to a net transfer of capital from indebted countries. And this is also a very important lesson with IMF, because the IMF restructuring process and multilateral institutions actually get involved to provide the cash to bail out the private creditor, not bail out the government. So basically facilitating capital outflows and increase indebtedness. This is a very important question of the responsibility of creditors and the institutions related who have responsibility for restructuring. Those are a number of principles. But in terms of very concrete suggestion for the short term, it has a number of very specific recommendations for dealing with the short term. One, that, for example, the IMF can use its catastrophe investment facility, the facility that is usually, that was initiated to address crises of economies associated, with health or environmental crisis. Increase that. And secondly, increase the issue of SDRs. And thirdly, the systems must allow holders of SDRs to convert them into hard cash, not just as reserves, without the ridiculous charges that associated them. Fourth, the IMF must reduce its own charges, because the cost of surcharges and its own interest rates always add up more or less to close to commercial rates. So they are not providing these bailouts. So that's the institutional part. There are several specific suggestions also related to the.
But let me ask you, Charles, too. I thought, taking into consideration capital outflows, I mean, at the center, Africa is at the same time a very robbed continent on illicit financial outflows, and particularly in the extractive industries. And there is a section here that speaks about the creation of a global fund to stabilize commodity prices. Can you speak to us about that?
Absolutely. So there are two issues associated with the commodities. One is the volatilities. So commodity prices swing up and down, 2-3 years, and so on and so forth, depending on all sorts of things. It is impossible for commodity exporters to be able to manage their balance of payment, credibly in that context. Many years ago, we had commodity agreements that stabilized this. These have now been thrown out. And so the suggestion that is being made is to set up a fund that enables commodity producers to have access to, low-cost funds when their commodity prices are in a downturn. That's the first part. There's a second part associated with the commodities, as you have said, in relation to the illicit financial flows. So the illicit financial flows is not only the precious natural resources that are being extracted, where through all sorts of schemes that the less value is paid for export, smuggling in addition, and so on. But there is also the biggest source of illicit financial flows is trade mispricing. So the under-invoicing of the value of exports and the overpricing of the value of imports that do two things: that transfer foreign exchange abroad to secret locations, losing the central bank access to the foreign exchange that enables them to be able to stabilize the current account and their exchange rate. And then simultaneously losing governments the revenues that they need to manage their fiscals. And this is the reason why the Thabo Mbeki report that was launched with UNECA and then, it remains a serious initiative. But as often is, actual implementation of its findings is slow, grinding, and non-serious. Those are the problems with the commodities things. And so in a sense, given that many of these debtors are commodity exporters, if you don't address these two debilitating factors on commodities, and then of course, there's a long-term issue on the commodities, countries have to diversify. And countries have to diversify, at least starting from the baskets of commodities that are produced and exported. And many of these African countries can diversify the basket of commodities that they are produced and exported. Thirdly, take a serious approach to industrial policy. And this serious approach to industrial policy means a deliberate effort to create a good mix of enterprise sizes and enterprise forms, and be consistent with that.
Sure.
And so on, and have a consistent incentive that encourage competitiveness.
Okay.
So those are the kinds of things that are implied in the commodities question.
Okay. Let me take a quick ad break and then we'll come back to wrap up the conversation.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
Just in the last 2 minutes, I'll give you each a minute to answer, of course, the Jubilee question. The prospect of particularly private creditors replying to this report to wipe out, to sort of do a tabula rasa. What's your view, Kamal?
It's definitely necessary.
But what are the prospects?
But the prospects, unfortunately, are very low. And one of the main reasons for that is because a lot of this debt is legislated in jurisdictions in New York and in London. And unless those countries change their laws to mandate private creditors to come to the table consistently and to end voucher funds and these kind of things, the prospects are quite low. The other reason the prospects are quite low is because it would require bilateral lenders like China and the US to come to the table together to find some kind of solution for the global south, which is increasingly becoming less and less
possible.
Exactly.
Charles, the prospect of Pope Francis's call for starting afresh a jubilee forgiveness of debt by particularly private lenders.
Some of the commissioners at the end of the report met the Secretary of State for the Vatican, and it appears as if the Vatican will appoint a high-level person to lead on this Jubilee debt question. One suggestion that was made during the conversation is for Pope Francis to hold a forum, invite the CEOs of the major investment firms, BlackRock and all of those. We know them. They are, and the ones that are holding bonds of the poorest countries, and an attempt to touch their humanity, because they are, after all, humans, and the cost of a one-off, decision to take major haircuts or to allow for far longer maturities on the rescheduling of existing debt to allow countries to recover. We made some specific suggestions on how this could happen. So I don't rule out that possibility. Not easy. Can't happen generally. It has to be a targeted conversation and convincing and pressuring.
Like the Muslims say, inshallah. But thanks very much, Charles Abugre, Executive Director of International Development Economics Associates, and Kamal Ramburuth, G20 Project Lead at the Institute for Economic Justice. Thank you both for creating time to join us here on Power Talk.
Thank you so much, Mbuyiseni.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Dr. Ngozi. Have a good day.
Same to you. It's 1100 hours here on Power Talk. We're going to take the news with Nyakalo Tefu.